بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to our continued reading and discussion of this great book of Usul al Fiqh, Lubb al Usul by Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari. Inshallah, in today's class, of course, picking up where we left off, we are going to continue the discussion of Mafhum al-Mukhalafa, opposite meanings. In today's class, we are going to talk about or introduce the concept of the illah, the ratio legis, and how you can make qiyas based on the opposite meanings. Of course, this is a foreshadowing into the whole section of qiyas, of analogy, and we're not going to really dig deep into the illah, but we will mention it, very quickly, and then following that, he will give us a list of types of descriptions that can be used for the opposite meanings. So it's kind of like a list, and then I'll try my best to give you guys some examples of that, inshallah, so we can understand how we can derive meanings from these examples. And then following that, we will look at, he goes into issues. So those are like the introductory remarks to statements, and then the rest, if I'm pretty not mistaken, the rest of the chapter are issues, issue one, issue. I number them for you so you kind of don't lose it. In today's class, we are going to take the first issue. The first issue is what is language and who has established language, al-wada'. Some ulama of usul will consider this, or some ulama consider this its own science, ilm al-wada', the science of establishment, but it's really just an issue. It's not, even if you find the books about this, they're like little booklets. It doesn't have to be its own science and its own class. But who establishes language? Of course, the dominant position for us is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala established language. So I want to talk to you about what that means, so we don't conclude the wrong thing from it. And then we're going to talk about words and the meanings of words, and how these words have been established to give us certain meanings. And then we're going to talk about direct language or literal language and figurative language. And then we are going to talk about using different words to mean different things in different contexts. So that's very important, because one of the things in the modern world, unfortunately, that's under attack are words themselves. People want to change what words mean. And you can, but there are certain parameters to that. You can't just do whatever you want. So that's actually kind of a pertinent discussion. Those are the main topics for today's lecture. I'll see you back for the beginning, inshallah. So let us turn now to the original text, inshallah, and let us begin our march through this discussion. Just give me a second. Okay, so he says, this is just picking up right where we left off. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين ولا يمنع قياس المسكوت بالمنطوق فلا يعم المعروض وقيل يعمه. So he says rahimahullah that one can make analogy between the unspoken meaning and the spoken meaning, since the unspoken meaning is not generalized by the ratio legis in the analogy, and is linked together through the qiyas, through the analogy. And a minor opinion says it is generalized. So we can make qiyas if we have a statement and then we have a unspoken meaning, or opposite meaning, I should say, rather, the opposite meaning, the mafhum al-mukhalafa. There can be a qiyas between them, because the meaning, the dominant position in the usul is that the meaning of the direct statement, the illah in that. Now, what is qiyas? Before I explain what is qiyas, analogy is to find the reason behind something and see that the reason behind A is similar to the reason behind B, so therefore A and B are analogous. That's, if you wanted to strip it down to its most basic thing, that's what analogy is. Now, of course, there's a whole chapter on qiyas, so we're not going to get into that, but that's what the illah is. The illah for us is a direct, the direct Latin translation of that is ratio legis, the reason behind the law. So, of course, the illah ratio legis is a legal term, but there can be an illah in other things. What's the reason behind this statement? So we call this also the illah. It's the same thing, but it's a broader usage than simply the law. So statement A, there is a reason to do something in statement A. Now, the opposite meaning, he is saying in the dominant position, the illah of statement A, the reason behind the apparent statement, does not necessarily cover and generalize the opposite statement. So therefore you do qiyas between them. Now of course, and he says waqila. So waqila yu'amun, some people say that the illah in the apparent statement covers it so that there's no qiyas. It's really not consequential, because the point is that there is mafhum al-mukhalafa. There is the opposite meaning, and as he will conclude at the end of this little section, it is a proof for us. Okay, so just again, one can make analogy between the unspoken meaning and the spoken meaning, because in the dominant position, since the unspoken meaning is not generalized by the ratio legis in the analogy, and therefore linked to it through the process of analogy. And a minor opinion says it is generalized. I think that's pretty straightforward. وهو صفة كالغنم السائمة وسائمة الغنم والكسائمة في الأصح. Okay, and then he says the opposite meaning, the mafhum al-mukhalafa, is a trait. At the end of the section, he will argue is a sifa. Some people will say it's not a sifa. We'll get into that later, which I don't even know why it's even included, because it's so esoteric, I find. But anyway, the opposite meaning is a trait. Such as he's going to give us an example from the hadith talking about the different type of zakah that's owed on goats. So in the first one, he says the grazing goats, al-ghanam as-sa'ima. So the goats in this example, their description is that they are grazing, which means, well, the opposite meaning is non-grazing goats. Well, he'll come to that. And then in the second one, he says sa'imat al-ghanam, the food of the grazing goats. Right? So these goats have zakah, and then this food has zakah, but they're described as, in the first context, the description is that the goats are grazing, and in the second example, the food is for the goats. And then in the third instance, he just says as-sa'ima, grazing as a description, because of their animals that are not grazing. So the opposite meaning, mafhum al-mukhalafa, is a trait, such as, quote, the grazing goats, or, quote, food of the grazing goats in the hadith, as well as the trait, quote, grazing, in the dominant opinion. And then he says, وَالْمَنْفِيُّ فِي الْأَوَّلَيْنِ مَعْلُوفَةُ الْغَنَمِ عَلَى الْمُخْتَارِ وَفِي الثَّالِثِ مَعْلُوفَةُ النَّعَمِ. That which is excluded from the first two examples, which were grazing goats and the food of the grazing goats, so that which is excluded, again, mafhum al-mukhalafa, are wild goats. The first two are excluding wild goats, because there's the grazing goats and the food of the grazing goats. So in both of those, you're excluding the wild goats, taking the majority legal position. And that which is excluded from the third description, which is simply grazing, are camels. Again, in the dominant position of understanding this issue. Okay? So because of this, we say that the opposite meaning is a trait. There's a trait, and now he's going to give us the list of potential traits. I don't want to make this overcomplicated. I think it's pretty intuitive and straightforward, but I'm just trying to do justice to the text. So I apologize if I'm kind of overkilling the topic. Okay, وَمِنْهَا, now he's going to give us the types of traits that can be considered that indicate for us opposite meanings. وَمِنْهَا الْعِلَّةِ, the ratio legis, obviously we just talked about that. وَالظَّرْفُ, prepositions. So, I think he has an example here. Like if somebody says, سافر سافر أو سافر غدا, travel tomorrow. So the opposite meaning is not to travel today. Right? So the dharf there, the preposition of tomorrow, indicates for us the opposite meaning. And this is why I apologize, because I mean some of this might be a little, too much. But let's just make sure we understand it together. So al-'illatu wal-dharfu wal-hal, conditions. He says, for example, أحسن إلى العبد مطيعا. Be good to your slave who is obedient. I apologize for the slavery example. I'm just reading from the text, from the Sharh of Shaykh al-Islam. So if the slave is not obedient, then you don't have to be good to him in this example. So there's a hal, there's a condition that would make the instruction applicable. Meaning, the opposite meaning is if that condition is not there, then there is no instruction. وَالشَّرْطُ, conditions. So he quotes from the verse, وَإِن كُنَّ أُولَاتِ حَمْلٍ فَأَنْفِقُوا عَلَيْهِنْ. If they are pregnant, then spend money on them. So there is the condition of the spending in this verse is that they are pregnant. So meaning if they're not pregnant in this condition of the divorce, then there's no spending in that period. وَكَذَا الْغَايَةِ, goals. So he says, for example, فَإِن طَلَّقَهَا فَلَا تَحِلُّ لَهُ مِن بَعْدُ حَتَّى تَنْكِحَ زَوْجًا غَيْرَهُ. If a man and a woman are divorced 3 times, if a man divorces his wife 3 times, it's a ba'in divorce. In this condition, they cannot remarry hatta, until, that's a goal, until that she remarries another man and she consummates that marriage, and then she divorces from that man and she waits the waiting period, then they can reset the marriage and the divorce. So this hatta in the Arabic language is used for ghaya. And by the way, from now on we will have to use the Arabic terms and stuff, because the language of the Sharia and the istinbat is going to be the Arabic language. So that's something that we're going to have to be comfortable with. So, and he says al-ghaya, the goal fil asah, so in the dominant position, because it's a difference of opinion. I'll pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. So continuing with our different types of descriptions and traits that can be found in statements that give us opposite meanings, mafhum al-mukhalafa. The last one that we just did was al-ghaya, or the goal. And then he says وَتَقْدِيمُ الْمَعْمُولِ غَالِبًا. This is advancing the object of the sentence in most cases. So the famous example is from Surah Al-Fatiha, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. The way you would normally say is نَعْبُدُ إِيَّاكَ. We worship you. But then the object of the sentence is now brought forward, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. And this is from the rhetoric of the Quran, the balagha of the Quran, to make ta'zeem of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to honor Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So obviously we bring Him first because He is the object of our worship. So He is Allah, so He comes first before even the act of worship. It's a very beautiful meaning and construct when you think about it from the balagha point of view. So that means we don't worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to emphasize that, we brought Him, in this case, that object of the sentence forward. وَالْعَدَدُ غَالِبًا, as well as in numbers. فَجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدًا. So lapidate them 80 times, meaning not more and not less, right? So that's the opposite meaning, is not more and not less, because there's a clear number. Now numbers are interesting. Of course, the ulama, when they come to do tafsir of numbers, some numbers are not literal, and some numbers are literal. Like in the famous scenario in the Quran, إن تستغفر لهم 70 مرة فلن يغفر الله لهم. If you make Ya Rasulullah, if you do istighfar for them 70 times, Allah will not forgive him. So the Prophet said, I'm going to do it more than 70 times. And then it became impermissible, after that to pray for the disbelievers in that scenario. So that's an example of, is that 70 actual, like 70? like there's 68, 69, 70, no more nor less? Or is it just saying no matter how much you do istighfar, it won't help them? Yani there's a different way of interpreting it. So that's why he says fil asah, in the dominant position. I mean, in here fajliduhum thamanina jalda, this is an act, so you can't lapidate them more than 80 times. You can't whip them more than 80 times, not less than more. That is the hadd, the punishment for this crime. But in other cases, the number, there are people that will interpret the number to just mean a lot or a little or something like that. In most cases, that's not the case, by the way. I should also say that. That's why it's the dominant position, is that numbers is a description from which we can take the opposite meaning, because the number means what it means. وتقديم المعمول غالبا والعدم ويفيد الحصر إنما. So using إنما to indicate restriction. إنما بعثت لأتمم مكارم الأخلاق. So the correct way of understanding that or translating that is, I was only sent to improve and refine human character. إنما is for hasr. Al-hasr is to lay siege to the meaning. Al-hisar is to put a siege around a city or something like that, so that nothing gets in, nothing gets out. So innama, you are laying siege so that no other meanings except what is going to happen. Innama ilahukumullah. He quotes that verse of the Quran. So that's obviously restricting the meaning, and then that means that there is no other deity in this case for Allah. Or in the example I gave you, there's no other reason that the Prophet ﷺ was sent except for refining human character. Okay, إنما ويفيد الحصر إنما بالكسر في الأصح, in the dominant position. ونحو ضمير الفصل, and this is a splitting the pronoun in a sentence, such as فالله هو الولي. And you can just say فالله الولي. Allah is the wali, is the wali in this case. But when you add the damir, called damir al-fasl, you add the extra pronoun فالله هو الولي, meaning nobody other than Allah is al-wali. That's the mafhum al-mukhalafa. So you see why mafhum al-mukhalafa is important, because even when we talk about these things, you probably are already saying mafhum al-mukhalafa on your own opposite meanings, but now you know that there's a legal and usuli construct for that. ولا وإلا al-istithna'iyya, and then using the word la, no, and illa, except, for exceptions. And he says that these are the most common kinds that are found. La illa used for exceptions, and this is the most common kind. So that was the translation. See if there's a useful example. La alim illa Zayd. There is no scholar except Zayd. So, I mean, that's pretty clear. Then the opposite meaning is that so-and-so is not a scholar or something like that. So la and illa, al-istithna'iyya, la and illa used in the construct of an exception. There is no this except this. There is no this except that. So that construct or that use of language is one of the traits that can give us the opposite meanings. Okay, now he says, let me just read the section and then I'll translate it for you. وهو أعلاها فما. So وهو أعلاها means la and illa. Sorry, la and illa are the most common types of traits found in the statements from which we take opposite meanings. فما قيل منطوق كالغاية وإنما فالشرط فصفة أخرى مناسبة وغير مناسبة فالعدد فتقديم المعمول. So he says rahimahullah, I can't read my own handwriting. Conditions that are considered other associated traits Sorry, I made a mistake. فَمَا قِيلَ مَنْطُوقٌ. So here we have been talking about understanding from the opposite meaning from statements. So, al-mafhum. Some people say that the opposite meaning is not a understanding, but it is mantuq, it is spoken. So people who say that the opposite meaning is spoken, mantuq, will say that what the list that we just made, there are other associated traits or they are not associated traits, like numbers and advancing the object of the sentence. And this is what I was saying in the beginning is perhaps a little too esoteric, because it's kind of, there's a little bit of circular, I don't want to say that, it's very, very subtle point. So some people are saying in the usuli world, in the past that is, are saying that this is not mafhum, it's mantuq. It's not something that's understood, the opposite meaning is not understood, it's spoken. So it's spoken like hatta, don't do this until, like the verse that we read about the divorce. So that's spoken. I mean, that there's a legitimate argument. Or innama bu'ithtu li'utammima makarim akhlaq. So it is also spoken that the Prophet ﷺ, through the construct of innama, excluded the other things. So that's spoken, it's not understood. So therefore, when we talk about conditions, a shart, the people that argues this will say that the condition is either an associated trait or a non-associated trait, because no one in the usul literature said that associated traits are spoken. Associated traits are all understood. Such as, and the examples that he gives are numbers or advancing the object of the sentence. So the difference here is the that which is understood, opposite meanings, are they spoken or not spoken? But both agree that they are opposite meanings. And then he says, وَالْمَفَاهِيمُ حُجَّةٌ لُغَةٌ فِي الْأَصَحِ. And then he says, opposite meanings are a proof in language in the dominant opinion, and nicknames وَلَيْسَ مِنْهَا اللَّقَبُ فِي الْأَصَحِ. And the nicknames are not included in them in the dominant opinion. It has to be a name itself. So this is a hujjah, as we've been saying, and a lot of our fiqh is structured around that. And then we'll take the final issue number 1, which will be our final discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, now for the issue number 1 that he gives, which is on language. مسألة من الألطاف حدوث الموضوعات اللغوية وهي أفيد من الإشارة والمثال وأيسر. From the subtle things that God has established for humanity is the creation of linguistic meanings. These meanings are more beneficial than signs and examples, as well as easier. Right? So this is a gift, this is from the altaf, the plural of latif, or that this is from the subtleties that Allah Ta'ala has given us and has distinguished our race, the human race, from all other creation, is the ability for us to articulate, to use words for meanings, and to stir the emotions and the passions through the use of these words. And they are more beneficial than signs. These meanings are more beneficial than signs and examples, as well as easier. So the easiest thing is just to be direct in one speech. وهي ألفاظ دالة على معان وتعرف بالنقل واستنباط العقل منه. The meanings of words are placed to indicate specific meanings, and these meanings are known through transmission as well as rational deduction from transmission. So words are placed to indicate specific meanings, and that's where that's so basic that sometimes we don't even say it, but that's how fundamental this is. Words have meanings. It's as simple as that. Who establishes those meanings? Ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. So Allah ta'ala taught Adam we call it like the proto language, maybe you can say, the use of all things, that this is a positive word, this is a negative word, this is a word for things that you can consume, so on and so forth. And then based on those first principles of language derived the human language that we have. And that's why, certain things in all languages mean the same thing, as it's either positive or negative. There might be some slight differences and nuances, but there are things that are scary, animals that are considered scary, and there's a reason why, because there's a word, and that word elicits that meaning, and then that meaning therefore is universal. It's not like a bunch of soup where any word can mean anything that you want, and it can mean what you want depending on how you feel. That language doesn't work like that. So words are placed to indicate specific meanings. How do we know these meanings? Through transmission, through a naql, through transmission of the deen, through the Quran and Sunnah meaning, and al-istinbat minha, and our rational deduction from the transmission. So here he's emphasizing that the dominant position that we believe in, it's so dominant he doesn't even give the dissenting positions, is that language is established through revelation. And that's very, very important for us to understand and to recognize. Now, we can deduce from the principles of revelation specific words and specific meanings. And by the way, in that deduction, that's where sometimes there can be differences of opinion, not in the words and stuff, but in general. And then he says, وَمَدْلُولُ اللَّفْظِ مَعْنًا جُزْئِيٌّ أَوْ كُلِّيٌّ أَوْ لَفْظٌ مُفْرَدٌ أَوْ مُرَكَّبٌ. The meanings of words can either be partial or complete meanings. They can also be single words or compound. So one word can mean something in its entirety, or it can be a partial meaning of something. And that goes back to the word being singular and compound. Like Usul al Fiqh. Usul means one thing, Fiqh means another thing, but when you put it together, Usul al Fiqh, you have something else, which is a science in with which we are studying. And then he says, الوضع جعل اللفظ دليل المعنى وإن لم يناسبه في الأصح. Establishing these meanings, al-wada', and that's what I was saying to earlier in the beginning clip, I think I said it, that some people consider that there is a discipline, ilm al-wada'. Establishing these meanings is to establish a relationship between a specific word and meaning, even if this meaning is not entirely appropriate. So, and this is what allows us to use specific words in specific sciences and disciplines, and to restrict their meaning, like a salah. A salah means, what we would say in English, prayer, which prayer involves dua, pleading to Allah, al-munajah, nightly calls to Allah, the emotional relationship. But when we say as salah, as Muslims, we mean something very specific, the actions that require wudu, that begin with the takbirat al-ihram and end with taslim. That's the definition. So that's an appropriate word. It's not like the word is not appropriate. It's appropriate, but we've certainly restricted the use of salah. So we don't say, hayya bina nusalli, let's do salah, and then we go like this and make dua. Christian Arabs will do that. If you're like in a Christian Arab church or gathering, they'll say it's time to do salah, or when I do my salah, meaning what we would refer to as dua. Right? So there are some words that have partial meaning, full meaning. Here he's talking about appropriate meanings or not. Of course, there's a difference of debate from our friends, the Mu'tazilites, who had a problem with this. وَاللَّفْظُ مَوْضُوعٌ لِلْمَعْنَى الذِّهْنِي عَلَى الْمُخْتَارِ. Words in the chosen opinion are subjects that appear in the mind. So if I say fish, something happens in your mind, you say fish. If I say mountain, something in your mind comes, you have a mountain. So there is a relationship between what it conjures up, which is why language, going back to what he said in the beginning, is so powerful, because it can bring out all of these emotions. وَلَا يَجِبُ لِكُلِّ مَعْنًى لَفْظٌ بَلْ لِمَعْنًى مُحْتَاجٌ لِلَّفْظِ. Words in the chosen opinion, often. Not all meanings require words, like smells, only meanings that necessitate words to describe them. Okay? So linking this to the previous statement that he just said, which is, just to repeat, words in the chosen opinion are subjects that appear in the mind, things that need to be appeared in the mind. So you don't have to, like a smell is not one of those things, because it's something that you have a sensory function for smell, the olfactory sense function that provides that. So not all meanings require words like smells. I mean, you can say it's a good smell or a bad smell, sweet smell or a pungent smell, something like that, but that's like a description. Not all meanings require words like smells, only meanings that necessitate words to describe them. والمحكم المتضح المعنى والمتشابه غيره في الأصح وقد يوضحه الله لبعض أصفيائه. Literal words, muhkam, are words that have clear meanings. Figurative words, mutashabih, so I chose to translate mutashabih as that. Mutashabih is, and it looks like this, it looks like that. So I think figurative covers that, because the word is not meant to be taken literally. I'll get back to that in a second. Figurative words are words that are not necessarily clear in the dominant opinion. With regards to figurative words, perhaps Allah Ta'ala shows their true meaning to some of His select. Now, literal words, muhkam, there's no ambiguity in the use of the words, or there's no confusion of what the word means. It means what it means, is what we're saying. And alhamdulillah, when we find those in the Quran and Sunnah, because then the understanding them just becomes that much easier. But unfortunately, or fortunately I should say, not everything is like that. There are figurative usage of language, as we will come to see very soon in the coming lectures, which require the proper understanding. Now, there are some things that are mutashabih, that are so figurative that only the awliya know them. These are things that have to do with the ghaib, and and Allah Ta'ala gives these people a type of fath. Shaykh al-Islam was a Sufi, and so was a Subki who wrote Jam' al-Jawama, which is why the final chapter is a chapter of Tasawwuf. وَاللَّفْظُ الشَّائِعُ لَا يَجُوزُ وَضَعُهُ لِمَعْنٍ خَفِيٍّ عَلَى الْعَوَامِ كَقَوْلِ مُثْبِتِ الْحَالِ الْحَرَكَةُ مَعْنًا يُوجِبُ تَحَرُّكَ الذَّاتِ. And then he says, words that are popularly known cannot be used for hidden meanings with the public, such as saying that the mode between existence and non-existence, and this is something that he says he'll pick up at the end of the book, it's a theological issue. People that say the mode of between existence and non-existence is, quote, a type of movement that necessitates movement of the essence, which can create some theological problems as it relates to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The upshot, you don't have to worry about that example, but what you need to know is that if there are popular words, you can't start then, that everyone knows, you can't start using them from something specific and then therefore create confusion. And that's what I was trying to say in the beginning clip. In the modern world, language itself is under attack, and it's important that we understand that there are certain parameters to the usages of words. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So, alhamdulillah, in today's class, we were able to wrap up the discussion of al-mafhum al-mukhalafa, the opposite meanings. And we looked at how in the dominant position, the opposite meaning is understood through qiyas, through analogy, because the illah of the ratio legis, or the reason of the apparent statement, does not cover also the opposite meaning, and therefore the dominant position is that it is a form of analogy. And then we looked at the different types of traits that we found in opposite meanings, and how when we identify the trait, then therefore the opposite is what the opposite meaning is, and how that's the dominant opinion. We gave several examples of that from the literature, and then we highlighted that there was a dissenting position that said that the opposite meanings are spoken and not understood. So therefore, they're understood through the statements itself, and some of the examples like innama and the goals. And that the traits are therefore associated or not directly associated, which I was saying is kind of a subtle thing, because at the end of, but the bottom line is both sides, both opinions say that there is opposite meanings, and that the opposite meaning is a proof. Following that, we concluded with issue number 1, which is the nature of language. So we learned that Allah Ta'ala establishes language, which is to establish meanings to words. The meanings that we get from the words make a mental map for us. and that words can either be can have a full meaning, partial meaning. Sometimes you have the wrong. You can use a word that gives a not so comprehensive meaning. That's also possible. And then we learned the important distinction between literal and figurative language. Literal language is obviously literal, it means what it means. Figurative language is it can mean multiple things in which you need to have the proper tools to interpret it. Or it could be something related to the hereafter that only those whom Allah Ta'ala selects from the awliya know. And then lastly, we said that words that are popularly known cannot be used for hidden meanings, because that's how you create fitna and create confusion amongst people. That's a kind of social commentary for us to consider. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.